Hello everyone, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in the Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and we will be learning today, Mirz Hashem, I hope, one second, I lost my place over here, bear with me for 1 second. Daf Nun Beis Amid Aleph, as well as Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis. So we have a lot to do. Let's get started. We pick up today. We are on the bottom of Nun Aleph Amid Beis. We're in the middle of Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Lamed Vav. So here in Sif Lamed Vav, the Mechaber told us, reading from the beginning of Sif Lamed Vav, on Nun Aleph Amid Aleph, the Mechaber told us, Yaseh Kol Parshi Yoseh Pesuchais, that we're supposed to make all of the parshas of the Tefillin, we're supposed to write them in the style of Pesuchais, open parshiyos, chutz mi parsha achrayna, with the exception of the final parsha of the Tefillin, the parsha of V'haya im Shemaya, haksuva b'Torah. That's the one that comes chronologically last to the Torah, Shivaya im Shemaya, sheya asena stuma. That parsha is supposed to be written in the style of a closed parsha, stuma ve'imshina pasol. The Mechaber told us if we change from that, if we alter the writing of the Tefillin so that we write any of the first three parshiyos in the style of stumais, closed parshiyos, or we write the final parsha, V'haya im Shemaya, in the style of a psucha, the Tefillin would be puzzle. Then the Ramah disagreed with the Mechaber. The Ramah didn't disagree. The Ramah brought down a shita. He said, V'yesh machshirim bechulam pesuchais. He brought down the Maram Padava, who said that b'di'eved, if we write all four of the parshas of Tefillin in the style of psuchais, it's kosher. And finally, the Ramah said, Uv'medinais elu noyegim af parshas V'haya im Shemaya b'rosh hashita k'shar parshiyos. Essentially, the Ramah told us that the minig became to write the final parsha, the parsha of V'haya im Shemaya, as a psucha as well. Now, we did the Mishnah Berurah, but we have one Mishnah Berurah left on what we covered already, and that is Mishnah Berurah Eis Cotton Kluf Samach Aleph on the very bottom of Nun Aleph Amid Beis. So let's just remind ourselves. We had the Machlokes, the Rambam, and the Rosh, what constitutes a parsha that's psucha and what constitutes a parsha that's stuma. Basically, according to the Rambam, in order to write a parsha as a psucha, what we have to do is, when we finish one parsha, so let's remember, we're talking primarily about the Tefillin Shel Yad. All of the four parshiyos of Tefillin on the Tefillin Shel Yad are written on one long piece of cloth. Each one of the parashiyos is written on its own amud. It's written on its own column. So, in order to make them psuchais, what we do is, we begin the parsha on the top line of the column, all the way at the right-hand margin. We don't leave any space. When we get to the final line of the parsha, we end it in middle of the line so that there are at least 9 blank character spaces from the end of the parsha till the end of that line. So at the end of the parsha, we leave a gap at the end of the line. Then we begin the next parsha on the very top line of the next amid, all the way at the right margin. According to the Rambam, that constitutes a parsha psucha. The new parsha begins at the very beginning of a line, but where the old parsha, the previous parsha, ended, there's a gap of 9 blank character spaces at the bottom line of the previous amid. That is a psucha, both according to the Rambam and according to the Rosh. Now, how about the stuma? The last parsha, the parsha of V'haya im Shemaya, the Mechaber said is supposed to be a stuma, and the Mishnah Berurah said we'll discuss later exactly how that parsha stuma should be written. And before we go on over here in Siman Lamed Vav, we have this one last Mishnah Berurah we have to cover, which is going to discuss the question of Tefillin Shel Rabbeinu Tam. Now we know that the primary difference between Tefillin of Rashi and Tefillin Rabbeinu Tam is the order in which the parshiyos are inserted into the bias of the Shel Rosh. And we'll discuss that in Siman Lamed Daled. But even according to Rabbeinu Tam, the parshiyos are required to be written kisidron. They have to be written in order. And written in order means that they have to be written in the order in which they appear in the Torah Kedosha. Now, according to Rabbeinu Tam, the order of the Parshios in the bias is Kadesh, V'haya, well, let's do Rashi first. It's Kadesh, V'haya ki yiviyacha, Shema, V'haya im Shamaya. According to Rabbeinu Tam, it's Kadesh, V'haya ki yiviyacha, V'haya im Shamaya, Shema. So Rabbeinu Tam switches Shema and V'haya im Shamaya. According to Rashi, first comes Shema, then comes V'haya im Shamaya, the way it appears chronologically in the Torah. According to the Rabbeinu Tam, when we insert the individual 4 parshias into the bias of the Shal Rosh, first we put in V'haya im Shamaya, and then we put in Shema. However, even though that's the order that the parshias are inserted into the bias in, according to Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbeinu Tam still agrees that they have to be written in the order in which they appear in the Torah Kedosha, which means that the parsha of V'haya im Shamaya has to be written after the parsha of Shema. Even though you're going to put it into the bias before Shema, but it has to be written after Shema. Now, that has a very interesting difference when it comes to the tefillin of the Shalyad. Why? Because in the tefillin of the Shalyad, according to Rabbeinu Tam, when it's all written on one cloth, the order is going to be Kadesh, V'haya ki yiviyacha, V'haya im Shamaya, Shema. That's the order that the parshas are going to appear on the one piece of cloth of the Shalyad. Kadesh, the next amid is V'haya ki yiviyacha, the next amid is V'haya im Shamaya, and the final amid is Shema. But even though that's the order that they're going to appear on the cloth, but the parsha of Shema has to be written before the parsha of V'haya im Shamaya, because it appears in the Torah earlier, and it has to be written Kisidron. So what do you do when you're writing Rabbeinu Tam Shalyad? You write Kadesh, you write the next Amid V'haya ki yiviyacha, then you skip an Amid. You leave an Amid blank, then you write the parsha of Shema, then you go back an Amid and you write the parsha of V'haya im Shamaya. Now, because of that, and this Mishnah Berurah would be a very difficult Mishnah Berurah to understand without this Hakdama. Because of that, says the Mishnah Berurah, very interesting thing. He says, the parsha of Shema has to be a psucha. Now, in order for the parsha of Shema to be a psucha, how do we make it a psucha? We start the parsha of Shema on the top line of the Amid, all the way at the right-hand margin, but the parsha before has to end on the bottom of its Amid in middle of the line, and we need 9 blank spaces. So, in Rashi Tefillin, what we do is we write Kadesh, we write V'haya ki yiviyacha, then we write Shema. Okay, so V'haya ki yiviyacha, we end in middle of the line, we leave 9 blank spaces, and then the next Amid we start Shema, and we start Shema all the way at the beginning of the line. Now the final parsha, V'haya im Shamaya, that parsha could be a stuma. The minig is we write it as a psucha, but it could be a stuma. So really, that means that the parsha of Shema, you don't have to end in middle of the line and leave 9 blank spaces. Really, you could finish it all the way at the end of the line. But now let's take a look at Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, you're going to write Kadesh, you're going to write V'haya ki yiviyacha. Then you're going to skip and you're going to write Shema. Now, the Amid before Shema, when you're writing Shema, is going to be blank. So puzzles the Mishnah Berurah like this. Maybe what you could do is write Kadesh, write V'haya ki yiviyacha, and the parsha of V'haya ki yiviyacha at the bottom of its Amid in middle of the line, leave 9 blank spaces, skip the next Amid, write Shema. Now Shema has a din of a psucha, because Shema is beginning on the top line all the way at the right margin, and the parsha before it right now is V'haya ki yiviyacha, because you're not writing V'haya im Shamaya yet. And V'haya ki yiviyacha ended at the bottom of its Amid in the middle of the line with 9 blank spaces. So when you're writing Shema, Shema is a psucha. Now finish Shema, Now you're going to go back and you're going to write V'haya im Shemaya. Do you have to end V'haya im Shemaya in middle of the final line and leave 9 blank spaces? Maybe you don't. Maybe you can end V'haya im Shemaya all the way at the left-hand margin at the end of its amud. Why? Because you're not going to say that Shema is a stuma. When Shema was written, it was a psucha. So do you have to leave space at the end of V'haya im Shemaya? Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes, you do. Let's take a look here in the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Beis. Mishnah Berurah is cut in Kosamach Aleph. V'chein b'tfilin shel Rabbeinu Tam. Similarly, when we write tefillin of Rabbeinu Tam, Yasa gam kein kulam psuchais. We should write all of the parshiyos in the style of psuchais, like the Ramah said that's the minig nowadays. We write all 4 as psuchais. Va'af shekaise v'haya im Shemaya achar Shema. Even though in Rabbeinu Tam tefillin you write the parsha of V'haya im Shemaya after you write the parsha of Shema, meaning that even though you're going to write Shema in the last amud in Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, not in the second to last like Rashi, you're going to write it in the last amud, but you write it in the last amud before you write V'haya im Shemaya in the previous amud. Still, Yaniach Kisher Teisha Oisiyos Achar La'aretz. Still, when we get to the words Al Ha'aretz, which is the final words of the parsha of V'haya im Shemaya, we have to leave 9 blank spaces. Ukeshakaisa parsha Shema, and then when we start writing the parsha of Shema on the final amid, which we do before we write V'haya im Shemaya, Maschil b'tchilas ha'amid b'rosh hashita, we have to start all the way at the right-hand margin on the top line. Okay. Now, against the backdrop of the rest of Sif Lamed Vav. So let's remember, according to the Mechaber, right, Kadesh is a psucha. So that means that the first parsha, Kadesh, you start the top line, right-hand margin. Nothing comes before it, right? There is no parsha before Kadesh. So the Mishnah Berurah told us yesterday that's called a psucha. When we finish the amud and we get to the end of Kadesh, we stop in the middle of the line, we leave 9 blank spaces. The next amud we start V'haya Kiviyacha, top line, right-hand margin. V'haya Kiviyacha is a psucha. When we get to the bottom of the amud, we end V'haya Kiviyacha, the final line, in the middle of the line, leave 9 blank spaces. We come now to the next parsha, Shema. We start top line, right-hand margin. Shema is a stuma. Now, is a psucha. Now, according to the Mechaber, the next parsha, V'haya im Shemaya, is supposed to be a stuma. Okay, and we said yesterday that we're going to discuss how to make Shema a stuma. So now let's take a look, starting from the final line, the bottom line of the Mechaber, Nun Aleph Amud Beis. Let's read the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, V'lochein. Since this is the way we have to write the tefillin, Noagu, the minig is, according to the Mechaber, Sheparshas Kadesh Li, V'haya Ki V'yacha, Uparshas Shema, the 3 parshas of Kadesh, V'haya Ki V'yacha, and Shema, Maschilin B'rosh Shita. They begin all the way at the right-hand margin, at the beginning of the top line. Ubesoif Kadesh Li, and at the end of the parsha of Kadesh, Ubesoif V'haya Ki V'yacha, and at the end of the parsha of V'haya Ki V'yacha, Manichim Chalak, we leave an empty space, Kidei Lichtov Teisha Oisiyos, the size where you could write 9 characters, right? That's what you do at the end of Kadesh, so that V'haya Ki V'yacha should be a psucha. That's what you do at the end of V'haya Ki V'yacha, so that Shema should be a psucha. But now V'haya im Shemaya, according to the Mechaber, is a stuma. So says the Mechaber, Ubesoif Shema, when we get to the end of the Amud, the end of the parsha of Shema, Ein Manichim Chalak. Now we don't leave any empty spaces. We go all the way to the end of the line. Why? Because we want the next parsha V'haya im Shemaya to be a stuma. V'im Manichim hu, and if the Sefer does leave any blank spaces at the end of the parsha, Pachas b'chidei lichtov teisha oisiyos, he should make sure it's less than 9 oisiyos. Because if it's 9 oisiyos, then the next parsha is going to be a psucha, and it's supposed to be a stuma. Uparshas V'haya im Shemaya, and the parsha V'haya im Shemaya, maschilim be'emtza shita elyoina, we should start it not at the right-hand margin. We should start it in the middle of the line. And we leave before it blank space with enough room to write 9 oisiyos. So what's the Mechaber saying? The Mechaber is saying, how do you make V'hayim Shemaya stuma? It's the opposite of all the other parshas. All the other parshas are psuchais. How do you make them psuchais? You end off the previous parsha in middle of the line, and you leave 9 blank spaces, and you start that parsha all the way at the beginning of the line. That makes it a psucha. But by the final parsha, the parsha of V'hayim Shemaya, you want it to be a stuma. So what do? You end off the previous parsha, not in the middle of the line, all the way at the end of the line. Or if you don't go all the way to the end of the line, at least make sure you don't have 9 blank spaces. Then the next parsha, V'hayim Shemaya, you don't start it at the beginning of the line. No, you indent it. And you start it 9 characters in. And that makes it a stuma, says the Mechaber. The Nimtza, and now it comes out, Sheshloisha Parshiyos Hem Psuchais Bein Laharambam Bein Laharosh. The way we wrote the first 3 parshiyos, the way we wrote Kadesh and V'hayaki V'yacha and Shema, they're psuchais both according to the Rambam and according to the Rosh, because the Rambam and the Rosh agree that this style creates a psucha. Uparsha Achroina, and the final parsha Stuma is a Stuma L'das HaRambam, according to the Shita of the Rambam. Because according to the Rambam, any time you start a parsha in middle of the line, it's a Stuma. So the parsha of V'hayim Shemaya, you're indenting. You're starting in the middle of the line. It's a Stuma. According to the Rosh, it's not a Stuma. Because according to the Rosh, in order to get a Stuma, we did the Dirshu footnote yesterday on Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. It was Dirshu footnote number 186, where we said that according to the Rosh, how do you make a Stuma? What you do is you leave a blank space in the middle of a line. So you finish the previous parsha in middle of a line, then you leave 9 blank spaces, and then on the same line, you start the next parsha. That's the way you make a stuma according to the Rosh. But in Tefillin, we can't do that. Because in Tefillin, each parsha is on its own amud. So we can't finish the parsha on one line and start the next parsha on the very same line. So we don't have the option of making a stuma according to the Rosh. So instead what we do is we make a stuma according to the Rambam. So, and this is all according to the Mechaber. So at least according to the Rambam, the final parsha, the parsha of V'hayim Shemaya, will be a stuma. Okay, a mouthful. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah back on Nun Beis Amud Aleph. Mishnah Berurah is cut in Kuf Samach Beis. Maschilin Beroish. He told us that in order to make the first 3 parshiyos psuchais, each one of those parshas is going to start on the top line of the Amid, all the way at the right-hand margin. Maschilin Beroish. Because this is going to create a parsha that's a psucha, both according to the Rambam and according to the Rosh. As long as you leave 9 blank spaces at the end of the previous line, according to the Rambam, as long as you leave 9 blank spaces at the end of the previous line, which in our case is the final line of the previous Amud, if you start at the beginning of the line, that's a Parsha Psucha. And the Rosh agreed to that style of a Parsha Psucha. Now the Rosh had another way that you could make a Parsha Psucha, and that was, according to the Rosh, you could indent the first line of the Parsha and leave 9 blank spaces before it. But according to the Rambam, that's not a Psucha. According to the Rambam, since you started in the middle of the line, it's a stuma. So how do we make a psucha both according to the Rambam and according to the Rush? You leave 9 blank spaces at the end of the previous line, the bottom line of the previous Amud, and you start the new parsha at the beginning of the top line. That's a psucha both according to the Rush and according to the Rambam. But if you don't start the new parsha at the very beginning of the line, and instead you make a little bit of an indent, even if that indent is less than 9 character spaces, according to the Rambam, once you indent, it's no longer a parsha psucha. Once you indent, it's a stuma, even if you don't indent 9 character spaces. According to the Rush, if you indent 9 character spaces, it's psucha. But according to the Rambam, once you indent, it's no longer a psucha, it's a stuma. So if we want to make the first 3 parshas a psucha, both according to the Rambam and the Rush, the eitzah is that end off the previous parsha in the middle of the line, leave 9 blank spaces, and start the next parsha all the way at the beginning of the line. That's a psucha, both according to the Rambam and the Rush. And he says to Mishnah Berurah, if you make any indent at all, Hare Parsha Zu Nikre Stuma La Rambam, then it's a stuma according to the Rambam, upsula afilu b'di'evet. And then the tefillin would be possible even b'di'evet according to the Rambam. Ubeprima Gadim Kasav, and the Prima Gadim is very machmir. The Prima Gadim writes, Ta'afilu im loy himshich lifnim beroish kadesh oivahoyu kiviyacha oishema rak ois achas oishtayim. Even if when you write the parsha of Kadesh, the parsha of Hayki V'yacha, or the parsha of Shema, even if you indent only 1 ois, it's possible according to the Rambam, even b'di'evet. Gam ken yesh lamer the puzzle. The Mishnah Berurah says v'tzarech iyon bozeh. We have to analyze such a tiny indent, an indent of a ois achas. Is that really going to make it possible according to the Rambam? The Mishnah Berurah says tzarech iyon, but the Prima Gadim says, yeah, if you indent 1 ois, it's possible according to the Rambam because it's a stuma. In the Sefer Marma Mordechai is implied, we shouldn't be so machmer like the Prima Gadim b'di'evet. But certainly l'chatchila, yesh lizar bazeh ma'oid, we should not make any indent at the beginning of Kadesh V'Kiviyacha or Shema, lest we make it a parsha stuma according to the Rambam. V'em hishir kishir tevas asher, if you indented the size of the word asher, near a lead yesh lahachmer afilu b'di'evet. The Mishnah Berurah says if the indent is the size of the 3 letters of the word asher, aleph shin reish, then the Mishnah Berurah says you should be machmer even b'di'evet. Why? You would think to yourself, it's only 3 oisiyos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, darei b'sher zeh, bevada yesh kishisa oisiyos kitanav yoser. That's more than 6 oisiyos. Why? Because aleph is the size of 2 yudin. Shin is 3 yudin. Reish is 2 yudin. So you really have 7 oisiyos here in asher. So that's not a small gap. That's already a big indent. That's an indent of 7 oisiyos. According to the Taz, he has another chumrah. According to the Taz, whatever space you leave at the end of the line of the previous parsha is mitzaref, it combines with whatever space you leave before the first word of the next parsha on the top line of the next amud. So now it comes out, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'harei l'das hataz, mitzaref medina l'kuli alma lihikare stuma afilu lo yaya areva shalamaylu lamata rak kishir tesha oisiyos ketanos al yidei tziruf u'kamar shekasav Prima Gadim. According to the Taz, you're going to combine whatever space you left on bottom with whatever space you left on top. So even if you only left between the 2 9 oisiyos, remember, an indent of 9 oisiyos on the top line of the next parsha certainly makes it a stuma, according to the Rambam. But according to the Taz, you don't need 9 oisiyos of an indent on the top line of the next parsha. Whatever space you left at the bottom line of the previous parsha combines. So let's say you left 8 ois at the bottom line of the previous parsha and 1 ois on the top line of the next parsha. Well, that combines for 9 ois. Now it's as if you indented 9 ois on the top line of the next parsha, and that's 100% a stuma, according to the Rambam. According to this Taz, when the Rambam says it's possible, if you make a small indent on the top of the next line, on the top of the next amud, it could be even a very, very small indent, even one ois for sure. If you left over space at the bottom of the previous amud. Al Kain, therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, if you start writing a new parsha, you start writing a new amud in the Shalyad, and you accidentally indented. What does it mean that you indented? Well, you made sirtut. You engraved a right-hand margin line on the cloth. So you're supposed to start right over there. If you indented even 1 ois, then says the Mishnah Berurah, when you go to the next line, don't start by the sirtut. Indent all the lines, even with the top line, so you shouldn't get into a shaila. Kov Samach Gimel, the Mishnah Berurah said the first 3 parshas, in order to make them bona fide psuchais, you have to indent Teisha oisiyos. Kasra Achrayim, the Achrayim right. It sounds very simple. 9 blank character spaces. Now we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah how you calculate these 9 oisiyos is not so simple. Kasra Achrayim, the Achrayim right. The Lechatchila Tzarech Le'aniach Kidei Shalosh Teivos Asher. What does it mean 9 oisiyos? It means the size of the word Asher written 3 times. But it doesn't mean Aleph Shid Reish, Aleph Shid Reish, Aleph Shid Reish. It means Asher. Now, to write Asher 3 times, you have to leave a gap between the words. How big is the gap supposed to be between words? We learned previously that when you write the tefillin, the gap between the words has to be the size of an ice cotton. That's the size of a yud. So it's Asher, then the gap of a yud, Asher, the gap of a yud, and then Asher. So 9 oisiyos is not 9 oisiyos. It's 9 oisiyos plus. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Al Kain, therefore, how much do you have to leave at the bottom, in the bottom line of the previous amud? You have to end the middle of the line and leave a gap of 9 letters. How big is that gap of 9 letters? Al Kain tzarich laniach gam kein revach maloi shtei oisiyos ketanos melavara teisha oisiyos. It's not just 9 oisiyos. It's 9 oisiyos and the 2 oisiyos ketanos between the words. So it's more like 11 oisiyos. Because if we're saying it's the size of Asher, 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 between Asher and Asher you have to leave an ois ketana. You have to leave a yud. So that's an extra 2 yudin. The Mishnah Berurah says, Lamaisa, you could be makel. If all you left at the end of the parsha was the size of 9 yudin, you could be makel. How do you measure the gap of 9 oisiyos? You go proportionate to the size letters that the Sefer is writing. So if the Sefer is writing this parsha very tiny, so then you measure with tiny oisiyos. If he's writing big, you measure with bigger oisiyos. We use the same style of measurement when we're determining if the parsha is a psucha or a stuma. The Mechaber says, what do you do by the last parsha? You make it a stuma according to the Das HaRambam. How do you make it a stuma according to the Das of the Rambam? What you do is, when you get up to the parsha of V'haya Mishamaya, you start it in middle of the line. You don't start at the beginning of the line. You start in the middle of the line. And you leave a gap at the beginning of the line of 9 oisiyos. And when you finish the parsha of Shema, that's the previous parsha, you don't leave any blank space. So at the bottom line of the amud of the parsha of Shema, you wrote all the way to the end of the line. Or maybe you left a gap, but a gap of less than 9 oisiyos. And then the parsha of V'haya Mishamaya, you don't start it at the beginning of the line, you indent it. How much do you indent it? You indent it 9 oisiyos, and according to the Rambam, that's a stuma. Says the Mishnah Berurah, va'afta ladasa rashi psucha. According to the Rush, this is not a stuma. According to the Rush, this is a psucha. Why? Because according to the Rush, that is a psucha. You make an indent of 9 oisiyos, that's a psucha. It doesn't matter what you did, according to the Rush, by the bottom line of the previous amud. That doesn't matter, according to the Rush. If you indent on the first line of this parsha, you indent 9 oisiyos, that's a psucha. So this eitzah of the Mechabers, of how to make the parsha of Hayim Shemaya stuma, doesn't work according to the Rush. According to the Rush, it's a psucha. So the Mishnah Berurah explains, Af ladasa rashi psucha, even though according to the Rush, this is a parsha psucha, mikal makayim anu oisin kach, however, this is the way we do it. Why? Ki ef shalasis betfilin surah stuma shiyatsa ba'alima de kulei alma. Because we can't make the parsha of Hayim Shemaya in tefillin a stuma, both according to the Rush and according to the Rambam. There's no way to be mekayim the Rush and the Rambam. Ki stuma she'anu noigin lasis b'sefer Torah, the style that we make a stuma in the Sefer Torah, which is a stuma according to the Rush, dahainu she'mesayim a-parsha shelafanea be'emtza shita, which is that we end the previous parsha in middle of a line, mafsik kidei teisha oisiyos, and then we skip a blank area of 9 characters, v'achakach maskal parsha she'acharei gam kid b'oisei shita, and then we start the next parsha on the very same line, v'hi nikrei stuma aliba de kulei alma, that would be a stuma both according to the Rambam and according to the Rush. Right? So again, you would finish the previous parsha in middle of the line, you would leave 9 blank spaces, and then start the very next parsha on the same line. That's a stuma according to the Rambam and the Rush, but you can't do that on tefillin. And that's a stuma according to the Rambam and the Rush, says the Chavetz Chaim, the stuma milofanea umila achareha. It's closed off both before the blank space and after the blank space. But we can't do that on tefillin. It's impossible to do that. To call parsha hu b'amid echad. Because each parsha is in its own amud. So we can't end the parsha and start a parsha on the same line. So there's no way to make a stuma that's a stuma both according to the Rambam and the Rush. Another way you could theoretically make it a stuma according to the Rambam and the Rush is go to a new amud, skip a line, and then start in middle of the line. Let's say you wanted to skip a line. You came to a new amud of Hayim Shemaya. Don't start on the top line. Skip a line. And then start Vahaya all the way at the end, all the way at the right hand margin on the second line. That wouldn't be a stuma according to everybody. It would be a stuma according to the Rush, but not according to the Rambam. To hear Rak Laharush, only according to the Rush would that be a stuma. V'lo la Rambam, according to the Rambam, that's a psucha. The l'didehi psucha. V'kevin she'iev shal asais a stuma l'divrei hakol, since we can't make it a stuma, both according to the Rambam and the Rush, nagu kar Rambam. We're noig to follow the Shitas of Rambam. Levi shekain ikar af b'sefer Torah. Im ef shalasis l'divrei hakol. K'moshe kasav yerdeh Siman ayin reish hey, which is really reish ayin hey. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, b'taz himtzi eitza la'asais stuma sheyatza aliba d'kuli alma. The Taz does give an eitzah how to make the parsha of Hayim Shemaya a stuma according to everybody. Dahainu shebeparsha rishayna ushniya yasa hakol k'moshe kasav b'shulchan aruch. How would you do it? Kadesh and V'hayaki Yivyacha, you would do exactly the way described by the Shulchan Aruch. Raksha, B'parsha Shema B'soifa, but when you come to the end of the third parsha, the end of the parsha of Shema, Yaniach Revach Pachas B'gdei Teisha Oisiyos K'tanois. Leave a space at the end of Shema less than 9 Oisiyos. V'chein Yaniach Revach Pachas B'gdei Teisha Oisiyos K'tanois B'tchilos Parsha V'hayim Shemaya. Then make an indent on the top line of V'hayim Shemaya, also less than 9 oisiyos. Now that you don't have empty space of 9 oisiyos in one place, only by combining the bottom line of Shema and the top line of Hayim Shemaya, he nikre stuma l'kuli alma. Okay. V'chein kasa b'tshuvas harama mipano u'bebir agra. V'chein mashma mipri begadim shekamu na'ag lasas kein. V'da, and you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah, Divyeved afilu imshia revach k'teish oises gedolos b'kotzad gam kein kosher. Even if you would leave lamaisa 9 blank oisios at the bottom of the previous amid and 9 blank oisios at the top of the new amid, it would be kosher. But the Eved de la Rambam histuma ula Rashi psucha the kasav de la el b'sif katan kuftun ches b'shem achrayim the schema the halacha kayesh b'achshirin, that the halacha is like the yesh b'achshirin that we had here in the Ramah, who says that even if you make the final parsha, the parsha of Hayim Shemaya, a psucha, it's still kosher. The yesh ma'agdalim shenagu lasis kelechatchila, the nara unara upashte, each one should follow his minig, the ayin bebir halacha. Okay, and with this we end the very complicated sif of sif lamed vav, and Mitzvah Hashem we will pick up next time at sif lamed zayin, and we will begin discussing making the bottom of the tefillin. Wow, what a siman. All right, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discussing limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Ram should said Yeshua Serfuas Parnas and Shidduchim to those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the BS Tzedek Meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.